research. In recent years, his research has focused on preserving Maine's oldest heirloom apple varieties, and he's played a key role in founding the Maine Heritage Orchard, which I got to visit this summer, and it is amazing. It's really beautiful. If you ever get a chance to get out there, you really should do it. Todd's a co-founder of the Historic Fruit Tree Working Group of North America, and he works on using an approach of blending modern molecular techniques and traditional archival and community-based research to help uncover the lost historical knowledge and providing new insights into the genetic heritage of these rare apples. So I would like for you all to go ahead and welcome Todd. Can everybody hear if Todd doesn't use the microphone?
Can everybody hear me if I speak loud? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, then I'm gonna turn this
I'm
on.
gonna just get rid of this because then I'm not pretending that you can hear me unless I make sure that you hear me. So in the back, if you can't hear me, just like, Todd, come on, give me a little more here. Okay. So this is one of the hardest talks that I've had to put together in years, because I'm in the middle of writing a book about the history of apples, and I have everything in my head. I have 14 million years of evolutionary history of apples, archaeobotany of apples being eaten by children 9,000 years ago in what is today Sweden. I have 18th century, 19th century, 20th century figures in my head, and I've been thinking again and again, how do we conjure the past? How do we think about what happened in a way that is about what actually happened in terms of the people themselves? Not how we imagine the past, but how they lived the past. So I've called this Conjuring the Past, or a historian's journey with time travel and mind travel. Because this work requires two things. One is to project yourself into a world that is unimaginable to you. One that is thousands of years ago, 10,000 years ago, human beings were eating apples. They were living with apples. They were planting probably apples. And for us to imagine the livelihoods of Neolithic farmers and gatherers is an incredibly powerful creative act that requires us to unthink the world that we know. And when I think about mind traveling, it's really also about taking ourselves out of our own like small modern way of thinking and asking ourselves, how did they think? How did they live? So I'm going to give you a little overview. This is sort of most of what I'll cover today. Not everything. I'll blend in some other things. I may remember other things that I'd like to talk about. So I'm going to introduce myself and how I became apple obsessed. I'm going to introduce you to this tree, my yellow bellflower that is across the street from my house. I live in a 1760 house in Ellsworth, Maine. I'm going to talk about how we have to hone our peripheral vision, see how to see things we don't normally see. And by the way, once you start seeing them, you cannot stop seeing them. Particularly the apples, seeing the past through apples. I'm going to invite you to think like a tree, but also think like a farmer or a gatherer in ways that are really foreign to us. I'm going to tell you what I've come to the conclusion that we need to do in order to tell the story of people in the past. In this case, I'm happen to be talking about people who were involved with making and growing apples and eating apples and doing things like that. Then I'm going to take you, I hope, into sort of an epistemic, like a way how we know what we know and what it's required for us to really understand the world as it truly is in front of us, but also as it truly was for past people. I'm going to tease out some of those questions. I'm going to talk a little bit about how Johnny Appleseed is not really the history of American apples. I'm going to touch on very briefly the reality that you all already know and that you're already doing interdisciplinary work. The world isn't divided by academic disciplines. The world is one big chocolatey mess. And you need a lot of tools to understand that. And you're never done acquiring tools. You're never done acquiring knowledge. So that how we approach this is so important to how we understand ourselves, the apples, and basically the world that we live in. And then I'm going to finish with the vignette of us discovering what is probably the rarest apple in North America. Okay, a little background. First off, on your right is a tree that's 11.5 feet in circumference. 200 years old plus, colorfully called Jake 1827. In Maine, when you find an apple, you get to name it. Our friend Rudy decided that it was going to be called Jake 1827. Beautiful yellow russeted apple, very high quality. It's a great example of what keeps me going, is meeting these sort of ancient beings. So let me start off though by saying thank you to Amy for inviting me, and for the team here for inviting me to come. I'm humbled. It's a great honor. I'm following after some of the people that I worship and work with very closely. So it's a delight to be here with you. And I hope that in the questions and answers, you will help me clarify your thinking about apples, because sometimes I think I'm being very clever and clear, but please ask any questions that you have. I really am deeply obsessed, and I'm particularly obsessed and in awe of trees that are 200 years old. I just met some pear trees in England that are 310 years old. And I just want to walk up and just like, oh, beautiful being, teach me. And it is an invitation to learn about the world in a way that we're unaccustomed to thinking, to learn from plants. Humans have been doing this for thousands of years. And I think that's probably one of the reasons many of you delight in being out in the field, because you're learning from the world around you. I was trained as a Latin American historian, studying 19th and 20th century Guatemalan state formation. One of those gripping topics that everyone here probably has questions about. But I got a job at College Atlantic 20 plus years ago, where I am the history department. And my job is to bring the past alive, basically for a bunch of students who are not there to learn history, but where history can be relevant to what they're interested in learning about. I stumbled across apples looking for a way to do community-based research that would allow my students to connect with the local community through place-based education. So you can see why Amy and the folks here have become friends of mine, because that's what you all do through the work that you're doing here. I've basically made it my life's work. It's the one thing I focus almost all of my free time, and a lot of my non-free time too, which is basically tracking down, researching, and preserving Maine and America's oldest heirloom fruit. The historical research is what I adore. I love finding that one resource that says, aha, this is telling me something we need to know. And I'm going to share a few of those with you today, because to me, it opens the world for us to rethink how things work. My day job is a professor at College Atlantic, and basically they say to me, what would you like to teach? And so I teach a class called Navigating Change, about how coastal communities are dealing with climate change and fisheries regulation. I teach environmental history, marine environmental history, history of race and racism in America, Native American history, and then specifically a research seminar on local Wabanaki history. Those are the tribes from our area. And as I said, I'm writing a book, and I've been thinking very hard about how to tell the story of humans and plants through apples in Maine. But as you know, every place is connected. So I've learned a lot about a lot of places, from the Caucasus to Cherokee orchards in Georgia, to many of the places out here. One of the reasons I initially came out here to Colorado was to visit with our friends, Addie and Jude Schoonemeyer in southwestern Colorado. because one of the characters in my book is a young man named Ellsworth Porter who leaves central Maine, tiny ass town called Mount Vernon, at the age of 16 and comes to southwestern Colorado, where the first job he has is carrying the post on snowshoes up to the mining camps in the mountains. And then he eventually settles down to plant orchards in the bottom of a Red Rock Canyon. There is no place more different than central Maine in this continent, probably, than Mount Vernon and the Red Rock Canyons of southwestern Colorado. So I was like, oh, I've got to learn about this guy. This guy's really interesting. So, okay. So where it all begins. So there's in front of my house an apple tree, which I have begun to try to imagine the day that it was planted, because it was planted, the day that it grew, you know, to 40 or 50 years old. The tree today is probably 180 years old. It tells a story. It's already lost 2/3 of itself. It's lost 2 of these massive major branches. The branches are probably about this big, and they've just fallen off one by another. And this tree really taught me about the fact that there are apples that have names, that have histories. And it was sitting right in front of my house for 10 years before I started to say, oh, young yellow bellflower, tell me your stories. So what's really interesting is I didn't have my peripheral vision. I wasn't looking at the tree that was across. I'd seen it. I'd actually eaten the fruit, but it did not occur to me that this particular tree had a specific history from somebody planting it. And interestingly, the rootstock is coming up, and that tree is going to fall over in 40 years or 60 years, and the rootstock is going to go for another 120 years. So by the time that rootstock gives up, that tree will be 400 years old, which is just remarkable to me. So I'll explain a little more of my trajectory here. So I hadn't really thought of apples as history. But one day, a friend of mine gave me, who's a biologist, gave me a book about genetic modification called Shrinking the Cat. This is by a science writer named Sue Hubble. And it's about that, you know, cats had to be domesticated. So they eventually domesticated in Egypt and then bred to be the current pets that we have. And in there, she had a chapter about apples. And I'm sure you all, you know, very knowledgeable about these things now, know that every apple, every seed in this apple is genetically unique. It's a brand new apple that's never existed before and will never exist again. So each seed is a unique cultivar waiting to happen. I didn't know that. I read that. I was like, what? I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. Apples came in plastic bags. They were green or they were red. And my mom and dad took us up to the mountains, and occasionally we'd stop at farm stands and we'd have these delicious apples that called wine saps or romes. And I was like, why don't I get these all the time? Why can't I have this every day? So I read this book. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I never knew this. And then I met John Bunker, who Amy explained. So John is basically a hippie farmer who graduated from Colby College, dropped out, moved to a hill in the woods, and lived as basically a homesteader for almost his entire life. He became obsessed with apples, and one day he was doing a talk locally to my town, in the next town over in Lemoyne. And I went to hear him. I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Somebody could be interested in apples if they paid really close attention to this stuff. And he was telling the story of a specific apple from a town right next to me. And that was the beginning of the slippery slope at which I find myself. I don't know if I'm definitely not at the bottom, but I am way down that slope right now. So, and I say, you know, the historian finds out there's so much to learn. You know, every seed is unique. The hippie farmer taught me there's 20,000 named varieties, perhaps, in North America. Really? Wait, 20,000? And then I found out in Maine, 800? What? And then I met the apple breeder, our friend Cameron Peace, who began to explain to us the DNA. I met the folks from here who are doing work from the sort of environmental sciences approach. And I learned again, like, what? How many chromosomes? How many combinations? What is extreme heterozygosity? So I found myself like being drawn deeper and deeper into this stuff that I really didn't know that I needed to know. And then I decided to write a book about the history of apples from a specific place with specific people that would tell a broader story. And that is where I suddenly found out that what I was writing about was probably the tail end of 20,000 years of human history. So as you can see, each stage, I found out there were more and more. So then seeing apples becomes seeing the past. It becomes an incredible way to tell the history of humans and our relationship to the world through plants. I'm sort of ashamed that it took me so long to figure this out. But once I figured it out, it's like, whoo, what a great way to tell the story. This, by the way, is a map of a Shaker village in Maine called Alfred, and it shows the orchard in the upper left-hand side. So this is one of the things that I love tracking down is old maps. It shows us where people planted trees, why they planted them. I have a similar picture that I almost used from the 12th century in Canterbury, England, that also shows their orchard. Because it shows us how they thought about theirs. So one thing when I say thinking like a tree, in Maine, we have a lot of seedling trees. So when I look at a tree, I have to look at it to think, how is it living? How is it growing? Is it an upright forest tree? Or is it a tree that somebody has cultivated, has created a vase pattern? Because no tree naturally grows. When you look at an orchard and you see that vase pattern, somebody took the central leader out of that tree and bent those branches down to make that tree. It's a human-made tree. So when I look at the tree, I have to think, like, how is it growing? Why is it growing there? But I also have to think like a farmer or a gardener, like, why the hell would somebody plant apples here? In Maine, we have a lot of them in ditches along the side of the road. And it's sort of an indication nobody planted them except by throwing an apple off out of the tree. And then I, as an empirically based researcher who's looking for evidence, am just like, please, goddess, let there be evidence that I can actually discover that will allow me to know with some certainty what I'm looking at. Because most evidence of human activity doesn't survive. So we're working with these tiny bits and scraps of how people interacted and lived with plants. What did they grow? Where did they grow it? How did they grow it? So what's the evidence? What kind of evidences have I come to be looking at? On your right is a series of small journals and diaries of farmers, unknown people, people who I don't even know their name, but their little daily diary of what they did is recorded. It survived somehow and ended up in in an antique store or in an eBay shop. And on this one, you can see the little white tabs. That's every place this farmer mentions apples. So it helps me understand, how did the apple fit into his life? What was he doing? And most of the time, he wasn't paying any attention to his apples, which for an apple-obsessed historian is kind of disappointing, but it puts it all in context. The other one at the top is somebody's little grocery book. They would go into a local grocery store and they'd write down what they were buying. So I can see what they're buying in the local store, so I can figure out, what were they eating? How did the apple fit into what they were eating? Now on your left, these are ancient peach pits, about 5,000 years old, from China. They think they think they're about that old. But so one of the things that's become evidence for me is archaeobotanical evidence of seeds, the survival of seeds in burials. One of the pieces of evidence that I'm using in my book, tiny pieces of birch chewing gum that kids in Sweden chewed on 9,750 years ago. And one of the things that's really cool about it, as they chewed on it, it captured the DNA of what they'd just eaten. And guess what they'd just eaten? Apples. So evidence presents itself in all kinds of ways if you hunt it down and carefully look. Charred seeds, dried rings of apples that are, thousands of years ago, begin to reveal to us what the history of people and plants. So one of the things that I always ask myself is, what are the questions I don't have that I need to have in order to answer this question? And this is really hard because it's like, and this is going to sound a little bit like Yoda. How do you know the things you don't know you want to know? Right? Because you don't know. So discovering that is this constant process of beginning to say, like, what do I need to know? So one thing that you probably already know, but I'll just say it because it's one of the things I didn't know I needed to know, is there's no apple in America that's super edible like our contemporary Malus domestica. There is this apple, which is Malus coronaria, what they call the sweet crab apple, which isn't very sweet. I say it's edible, but not particularly palatable to us. But they don't exist. They come here with Europeans and are introduced in the 16th century at some point. We don't know exactly when. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And they almost certainly came from early fishermen who were fishing along the coast of New England after about 1500, ate an apple, threw it over their shoulder, it floated or landed on the shore or floated inshore, rooted, and grew. And this happens all the time in Maine. If you come to Maine anytime, you'll see apples all along the shore, right above high tide mark, because the apple cores get washed up just behind the seaweed, and they take root and they live. So there are no native crabs that are super edible in either Maine or Colorado. You all are sort of on the outer edge of Malus ioensis. We have no coronaria or any crab apples in Maine. So this is really interesting. When you think of, for us, our relationship with apple is almost exclusively taking an apple and going munch, 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 munch. They made vinegar with it. They made cider with it. They dried it. One family in Maine cut and pared apples, so many apples that when they were dried, they had dried a half a ton of apple slices. So think of that, like, ooh, that's a lot of pairing. That's an interesting relationship. So cultivating that idea of what was the relationship of people to plants, to fruit, to these new introduced varieties. And for example, in this area in Maine, what was the native relationship to plants at the time that European fruit? Because these fruit will fit into native ways of growing, cultivating, protecting, encouraging. And then also, where did the diversity come from? Where did 20,000 named varieties come from? Is a really interesting question. But then it always, you have to also cultivate. So this is from my friend John Bunker, an early introducer of Zen Buddhism in America, to America. There's a Japanese author who talks about the beginner's mind and the danger of not recognizing that your experience is both a blessing in that you have experience and be a curse in that you think you know, right? So one of the things about being a researcher and a storyteller is always reminding yourself about what you don't know and the value of approaching the question with openness every time. Particularly the capacity to unlearn. This is extremely important because when you sort of question where were apples introduced, instead of just assuming, oh, it must have been the Pilgrims, it must have been Jamestown, it must have been here. Apples are introduced into Texas by 1680. So the idea that apples probably in this area came from the south instead of from the east is something that should be taken very seriously in this area. But that's not how, you have to sort of unthink the spread of American settlers, Anglo-American settlers. you also needed to have this idea of really thinking in deep historical time. I mean, obviously, apples that are planted on the Front Range of Colorado is a tail end of how people have grown apples and related to apples over millennia. And to me, that's super interesting that our way of like munching on whatever apple we find in the supermarket is the tail end of many, many generations of different relationships that people have. And that I say foreign lands in the sense of really trying to imagine other places, other imaginaries, other relationships to help us then tell the story and understand how things may have happened. And then, of course, the art of the question. And again, how to ask the question, who was it that probably planted the first apple trees in North America? And this is really fun because if you're creative, you can ask questions that you can actually answer because you can find evidence. Okay, so what's the evidence? Okay, I'm just going to tell you, I've spent about a year and a half completely and utterly obsessed with finding the very earliest evidence for when an apple, European apple, was present in North America. And I can say with some confidence, because I've spent a lot of time, I'm sure that we'll find other evidence. 1524 is the first report of an apple that a European saw in North America, in sort of southern New England, where he recognized an apple that he called the Api apple, the lady apple, which is a small, very ancient European apple, somewhere we think along the coast of Connecticut or Massachusetts. This apple almost certainly was either planted by a seasonal fisherman who was coming over to catch cod on the coast of Maine, coast of Massachusetts, coast of Connecticut, or an apple that was pitched over their shoulder. There were approximately 300 fishing vessels every season, every summer on the coast of Maine from about 1500 through this period. So this seems to be the place where apples are first introduced. The first orchard recorded as being planted is planted in 1604 on an island between Canada and Maine on St. Croix. The next one is 1608 up in Nova Scotia. 1613, there are records of apple trees actually being planted on Mount Desert Island where I teach near Bar Harbor. First shipment of apple trees, 1631. On the ship the Lion, 300 trees brought from England to the New World. About the same time, interestingly, the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay got an apple from the local native Indians that's called orange sweeting. It's the first named apple in North America. And I'm going to come back to this. And they got it from Native Americans. And then the first nursery, 1648, the first recorded evidence of a nursery in North America is 1648. So I know for you all, this is ancient history compared to Colorado history, but it sort of gives you a sense of the beginnings, at least in the northeastern part of North America. So what's very interesting is there are a lot of things that people say that have no basis in fact, but they get repeated again and again and again. So this is a quote that my friend John Bunker said, and I jumped all over his ass. You don't know that? That's crazy. He said, most New Englanders planted their apples from seeds. I was like, how do we know this? How do we know this? And he and many people say, well, because, Hedrick and others in 1880s, 1890s, that's what they said. 1880s? So they're talking about something that happened 200 years earlier with confidence? So the question of where's the evidence, follow the evidence, is so important in this work because I'll agree that many trees, perhaps most trees, could have been planted from seed, but until we have evidence, we have to be very careful about how we talk about it. And I always say this is very important, particularly for you all that are interested in STEM and this sort of stuff. There are basically two kinds of questions in the world. There are empirical questions, questions for which there's evidence, which can answer the question. And there are questions for which that are non-empirical, there's no evidence. And so, what's your name? So Luke and I can sit down and talk about whatever the hell we want. He's like, look, I think apples are really cool. And I think this must have happened. Oh, that must have happened. And it's a great conversation that Luke and I have, but it's not going to be resolved by evidence. And it should never be treated as something that, it's interesting. Look, let's have tea and let's talk about it. But it's not something that's going to inform us about the world as it is or the world as it was. Does this make sense? And being able to discern the things that we can have evidence about and resolve versus the things that we have opinions and we want to talk about, that's really important because that's the difference between research and conversation. Does that make sense? This is really, to me, very important. Because we have to always ask ourselves, how do we know this? And the courage to recognize when we don't know something. And I'll say that one of the things that has really complicated my work is the DNA evidence, because it gives us an answer, again, to a question we didn't have, but for which we do not yet have much evidence, except that there's this genetic trace. One example that I'll talk about later, almost all early American apples have a French ancestor. Almost none, based on the DNA evidence. There are other cases that do have English ancestors, but almost no early American apples have English ancestors. That's weird. How could this be true? So I'm going to go back to this for a second. Wait, what? Pilgrims got apples from indigenous people? This is, to me, one of the most interesting questions that I'm pretty sure I will never be able to discover any evidence about, but that to me is a gripping question because it basically points out that Native Americans may have grown European fruit for generations before Europeans show up in New England, which to me is like, cool. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about what I call placeholder histories. How many of you have heard of Johnny Appleseed? Okay. So just really like in one sentence, why do we care about Johnny Appleseed? Anybody? Yeah. Who did what? Okay. That's an excellent question. So for those of you on Zoom, our answer was that he's a sort of mythical figure that is sort of an American folkloric figure who planted apple trees. What's interesting about Johnny Appleseed is almost everybody knows this story as if it's an important story. There were hundreds of Johnny Appleseeds. It's just that guy happened to have a really good PR department called Disney. Because Disney made, he was like a popular figure, but he wasn't really anything until Disney made a movie about him. And then people said, oh, this is great. We'll tell the story of Johnny Appleseed, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, and maybe Paul Bunyan. This is America. The funny thing about Johnny Appleseed, there were French settlers in the Ohio Territory in 1680, 1690. He shows up in 1840. He didn't introduce apple trees. He sold apple trees to people who had to buy apple trees to prove so that they could keep the land that they had homesteaded. It's an interesting question, but the reason his apple trees were so important because land speculation in America was a really huge problem. And they had to make sure that if Luke, I'm just going to pick on you again, if Luke took a homestead, he was actually not just going to flip it and sell it to his neighbor. He was actually going to settle down and live there because the point was to give people who didn't have land. So Johnny had the thing that everybody needed was apples to prove that they had improved. And he said, yeah, I got, imagine Johnny Appleseed as like the Godfather. You need apple trees. For you, I got apple trees. Everybody needed 50 apple trees. And guess what? Johnny, he could hook them up. He could fix that for you, right? That's a much more interesting story, that early America, rather than like, this crazy guy who planted apple trees, he was helping try to stop the problem of land speculation on land that had been taken from indigenous people. Now that's a really interesting question. So, so I'm going to jump to a few vignettes. So this is one of the things about the apples. I'm going to talk about an apple called Drapdor that turned out to be in the background of all these apples in Maine. So I started to say, look, how is this possible that this French apple is the mother and grandmother of so many of our apple trees? So 1524, one of the first people passes through Maine. Cartier goes through in 1534. And the reason this matters is just, I'm not really a fan of timelines, but it sort of gives you an idea that Europeans are coming through. St. Croix is 1604, 1605, the first orchard. So French settlers probably bring a French apple to Maine very early on, and then that gets into the background of many of our trees. This is a picture of Quebec. Most of us don't think very much about Canada, but Maine was Canada. Maine was New France until 1760. And you can see the orchards all down along the river, down here, over there, over here. This is New Amsterdam, what we call New York today. And you can see all the apple trees, right? So apple trees are introduced very, very early by European settlers, primarily from the continent, French and Dutch settlers. Did I tell you I love evidence? I also love to win an argument. And so when John and I were bickering about like, well, are trees planted from seed? Are they grafted? I was like, well, I'm going to find evidence. And to my great delight, I found the record of a nurseryman from 1648 where he tells us what he's growing and who he's selling it to. And I'm like, I got the list. I got the goods. I know what was being grown within 20 years of the settlement of New England, what was being grown. And I know people are buying these trees. I know these grafted trees are going in the ground because I have this evidence. It's almost, this would be a great, this is a great exercise that I try with my students occasionally. This is what you have to read, right? And you go through and say, apples. So you eventually get good at reading. It's called paleography. It's one of the skills that they teach us in grad school, because this is basically illegible to almost all human beings. So what I was able to do is like, this is the group of apples. These are the group of English apples that should be ancestors of early American apples, but they're not. So I know these were all grown in 1660, 1670. So again, you can see like, I like generating these questions, like, what the hell is going on? These apples are grown in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and yet they have not yet turned up as parents of early American apples. What has turned up are these apples, these French apples that I call les grand-mères, the grandmothers. Renette Franche, Drapdor, Renette de Hollande, Renette de Calme, and Calville Rouge. Interestingly, they're the parents of all kinds of American apples and all kinds of English apples. And Americans love France, but they tend to think that everything American probably comes from England. And it appears as if this is not the case. And again, I mentioned this already. They're in the upper Midwest, and I didn't know this. I'm ashamed as a historian that I didn't know this. 4,000 French settlers in the upper Mississippi River Valley by 1700. And I use this map frequently in one of my other classes. And it turns out, so this is sort of Illinois, where the sort of French were settled. And it's very interesting. I didn't never notice this, but there's like a little line here that says Rivière des Pommes, Apple River. And I'm not sure what this is evidence of, but I was like, oh, Apple River, cool. Like, and this is a very, very early map. So it indicates possibly that native people had, along with French people, planted apples all throughout the upper Midwest by 1700, 1740. So, and as I've said, Maine was New France, we were Canada. And this is a map from very early on. And what it shows you is these little things that said French inhabitants. So this is down just about 12 miles west of me in a place called Castine. There's this up on the top, it said Monseigneur's Castine's houses. He was a trader who lived with Wabanaki family in this area. These are people further down the coast, French habitants. So when Anglo-Americans show up, they start to write all these histories about, like, such and such, Peregrine Wright was the first white child born in Maine. And it's like, yeah, that could be true, because the French are actually living with Native Americans, side by side with Native Americans, often intermarrying. But there's this whole history that just gets erased when Anglo-Americans show up. They're here for 125 years. So, and then I'm going to jump to this. So then with the apple drap d'or that we were looking for, we were interested in, because it's one of these ancestors, William Cox in 1811 paints a picture of all the apples that were widely planted in Eastern North America. And it turns out he had this one apple called Paradise, which is a very, very old apple, probably from Roman times. It's probably the ancestor of modern dwarfing rootstocks. And it was being grown in the United States in 1811. So was drap d'or. There are many others. These are beautiful watercolors. They're the first full representations of American apples and European apples in the New Republic. And then there's drap d'or. So one of the things, as we found from our friend Cameron Peace, drap d'or, with the help of a friend from the Netherlands who does genetic inferences of parentage, drap d'or is one of these lost ancestors. And last year, we submitted a bunch of leaf samples from our area, and our friend Cameron Peace wrote back and said, wow, you found unknown founder 13, drap d'or, growing on a tree in a farm in Maine, on a tree that was not particularly noticeable. If you walked by, you're like, oh, that's an old tree. But it's probably, if we're correct in that it was continuously propagated by first French settlers and then English settlers, it's probably the oldest continuously propagated apple tree in North America. And it's almost a miracle that we found it. I've been there 5 times. The tree, when I went there, never had fruit. So I'd be like, oh, well, I'll have to come back and see that tree later. But luckily, with the DNA testing, we're like, well, why don't we just take leaves from it and see what it is? There's also another one there, which we call colorfully AMHO 502, which is equally interesting and probably has a similar parentage, but has not popped up as matching any of these really old French cultivars. Beautiful, gorgeous, distinctive. So we know we've found something really fascinating, but we have no idea what it is. This, by the way, is the tree. This is the drap d'or. And again, if you walk by it any day, out on the open spaces here, you'd be like, oh, cool tree. But probably the most interesting tree that we found, and again, I think it may be the rarest tree in North America. And it's just in somebody's backyard. I love this. So my conclusions, and this, I'm trying to wrap this up so you can ask all kinds of delightful questions. So first off, work with cool people. Apple people are cool people. Like I I've met one guy who's kind of an asshole, but other than that, like of all the people that I've worked with, Apple people are really cool. They're really interested in interesting things. Because this is really important. And I'm speaking directly to the students in particular, but all of us in general, to remind ourselves, it is important to work with cool people. If you can arrange your life to work with cool people, your life will be a better. I can certainly say that that's been the case in my life. build teams. We would not have discovered this tree if we hadn't been working together. This is one of the lessons that I've taken. This is why, as Amy said, I've decided that I'm going to try to lead this work with the collections managers. We all get so much further when we work together. It's just amazing. You know, the rigorous unlearning that's sort of constantly trying to remind ourselves how we know things and what we still need to learn is a constant process. You don't go through it once. You got to do it constantly to sort of say, well, why, Dr. Fancy Pants, why do you think you know that? Like, and we have to do it to ourselves, right? And each other, gently. And then feed your curiosity. One of the things that I love about the apples, it's a question. You pick up this apple, right? And you put it in your hand, you say, what the hell is this thing? What is this thing? And it just feeds your curiosity. Who planted this thing? Where the hell did this come from? You know, blah, 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 right? So that curiosity will actually keep you moving forward. And as you can tell, I think you can probably tell from this, the new questions then like, oh, like what do we know about, you know, indigenous people and European fruit? What could we know? Who's done that work? How can I find out about it? It's just truly amazing. So thank you for paying close attention to me as I rambled on. And I'll take your questions now. Yeah. Great. So I'll repeat the question. So the question was, do I have any sources on the history of apples from Guatemala? Yes, very, very few. So when you're in Guatemala, up in the highlands, so one of the things, Guatemala is a lot like Colorado. There's really high altitude, so it's a tropical environment, but high desert plain. Apples are being grown at like 7 or 8, 9,000 feet, similar to here. And they had apples that they were growing and making cider, French or Spanish cider, sidra, what they call sidra, by 1560, up in the highlands of Huehuetenango, up sort of in the real high highlands. But nobody has done that work yet. And so I'm thinking maybe one day I'll finish this book that I'm writing. Because that is really hard, because one of the things about something like that, it's true in general, this work is totally a needle in a haystack. You're looking for somebody who happened to write something down, not about like gold and silver that they're bringing back or this or that thing that they're growing or whatever, but that actually says, oh, this is what we're growing. So I hope to have time to dig into that. But it's really interesting. We don't think of apples in someplace like Mexico. Hernan Cortez, the conquistador of Mexico, he plants apple trees in Mexico in 1530. So they become part of the everyday life there, and then Peru by 1580, something like that. So I'm waiting for somebody to write that book so that I don't have to. Other questions? Yeah.
Was Apple originated in China?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So the question was, working in Maine, what do I know about the origins of apples in China? So the basic model that we have an understanding of how apples emerge is the primary contributor to the contemporary eating apple in both China and in the West starts in Kazakhstan in the Tian Shan Mountains through Malus cerevisiae. And they move into both regions basically the same time, maybe about 4,000 years ago is the evidence that survives. That said, there is evidence, ancient evidence of relationship with fruits and fruit trees and apple trees, but not Malus domestica, other species of apples that grow. There are several dozen species of apples in China. The history of apples has not been well represented in English for English readers, but it is basically the case that as they diverge, there's a 4,000-year history or more in China, and a similar history in the sort of Fertile Crescent before they moved to the west. But it's a really fascinating story because really what flowers, what becomes super important in China are peaches and pears and plums. So apples are important, but they're not as important as, yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, and the trade routes are really interesting because I was saying this to Amy. One of the things that people say is like, oh, they move along the Silk Roads, but people are moving back and forth all the time. And one of the things that I am persuaded is the most important question is how did plants move with people? And how did they move without people? So once people begin to move plants, particularly apples, at first they're moving seeds, then they're learned to graft and they can move trees. So, so I have to say I've resisted trying to learn the history of all the fruit in Asia as well as all the fruit in the rest of the world. Maybe again, that's the next project that I should brush up on. Yeah.
So did you find like the evidence that you showed us?
Okay, so this is one of the things, for example, the nursery book. What you do is you read authors who mention something, who then mention something, that then cite something, that then cite something else, and then again they cite. And so this was actually a comment, following down people's sources. The nursery account book is in Connecticut Historical Society, and the guy was named Deacon Wolcott. He was actually from Somerset in central southern UK, and his son or grandson becomes governor of Connecticut, and so his papers sort of get preserved with his grandson's papers, and everybody else is interested in the son or the grandson because he's an important political figure. And I was like, screw the political figures, who is growing what, right? So I'm a pretty typical social historian in the sense I want to know like what was going on. Very interesting thing about him is he quits the nursery business because he's making so much money on cider. After a while, he has so many trees and he's making so much cider that he's like, oh, no more nursery gun. So he gives that up. Yeah, you had a question. Sure.
They could hear about why the work is important and what practical implications it might have. And the other one is wondering if you know what the first apple in New York City was.
The apple in New York City. Oh, okay. So the questions were, what are the implications? Why is this important? And then what the earliest apples in New York City were. Okay. Well, I think this matters because it matters where we come from. It matters who we are in the world. And we're not just like little tiny atoms like floating in the world. We are totally and deeply connected to people who come before us. And to people who we never knew, we'll never know, we don't even think of as our ancestors. But for me, one of the things about the work that you all are doing here in Boulder, the work that we're doing in Maine, is we are connected directly to people across every generation, right? And it turns out that I think, as a historian, obviously I would believe this, but I believe this, that if we don't understand ourselves as connected in that way, deeply, to all other human beings through these kinds of stories, we've completely lost ourselves. We're forgetting who we are. And it seems to me quite interesting. And again, the way to think about this is, first off, when I'm doing conservation work, for example, this apple, which is the Drap d'Or, I am preserving fruit for the next generation and the generation, people who I will never know. To me, that is a really important act of keeping the threads that bind us all together alive in the world. I mean, quite literally alive in the world. These aren't like, from my perspective, abstract stories. They're actual human beings who planted actual trees, who we have the great privilege of being able to pass that on to the next generation. The other reason that I think this work is important, and I hope I've been able to infect you all with this, it's inspiring, right? You say, oh my God, this is so cool. These trees are still here. We can still save them and pass them on to the next generation. Now, obviously, a lot of times when people are asking that question, it's like, well, actually, will commercial producers ever produce Drap d'Or again? I don't care, right? I think that if people are growing these fruit and it makes them happy, the world is a better place. And there's always this dream, I think, a sort of starry-eyed naivete that some of us have is like, wouldn't it be cool if everybody had an orchard? The world would be so much cooler, right? And it's not everybody has to have an orchard. It's like if you all wanted to have a few trees, it'll make your life better, right? And I think the other thing is it's quite clear from this work that we're not just connected to 3 generations or 5 generations or 6 generations. We're connected to hundreds of generations of people who've moved plants around, who've lived with plants, who've learned from plants. And from my perspective, it makes you a better being in the world to honor that connection. Now, not everybody has this luxury. Like, oh, does everybody have land? No, but not everybody has land. But to sort of say, okay, what do I want my relationship to the actual world to be? And it turns out there are other things in the world than apples. Who knew, right? That you might become totally obsessed about something else. And by doing similar work in a similar area, I've seen there's a really cool researcher at Utah who's an indigenous woman doing work on peaches among the Hopi and Navajo, who's trying to revitalize that tradition. Everybody has a role to play. And to me, one of the things that's really important about it is we are preserving something for future generations that we can't even imagine what they're going to use it for. There is like a practical answer. Climate change is going to change some shit. So having lots of different apples and lots of different things that grow in lots of different ways, that would be a good thing. And these apples are the accumulated selection of thousands of people over thousands of years. It's a tool that we will need. So that's the not the philosophical grand optimist or whatever. So, and then what was grown in New York? I would dearly love to know. One of the things that there are very few records of what they were actually growing. The indications are actually that this Drap d'Or may have been one of the apples they were growing, because a very old apple called Asopus Spitzenberg that comes from sort of a Dutch settlement in the Hudson River Valley has this in its background as a mother, as a father. So they may have been growing that. And again, we're hunting hard for resources that tell us what was brought. If I could find a nursery book that told me what was being grown, I would be delighted. But again, one of the things about the Dutch history is everybody knows sort of, oh yeah, New Amsterdam, blah, blah. But most of those resources for the Dutch are just not translated. They're not accessible. People haven't really written that history. So thank you, yeah. Maybe one last question? Anybody?
So, that question.
Okay.
Gas stand last year. Favorite apple?
Oh. Whew.
All the fingers you've tried.
Okay, I'm going to give the honest answer. It's not the answer you want. I am very easy. I will tell you that when I am out in an orchard in October, it's like a cold morning, the fruit is cold, and I walk up to fill in the blank. I dig my teeth into it. I'm like, oh, wow. I will say, but so there are lots of them. Asopus Spitzenberg, way up there. Drap d'Or is amazing, but again, I know that when I'm eating, I'm like, oh, this is the coolest apple in the world. Is it the best tasting apple? It's a pretty good apple. You can see why they used it, but it's a great apple. So the stories are the thing that really I really like. The other thing I will say is this fall, I've been on sabbatical, so I've been able to do whatever I want. I went to one of the offshore islands on the coast of Maine called North Haven, and they took us to this apple. And I went, it was gorgeous, like purpley red stripy thing. And when I had it, I was like, oh, wow. Oh, wow. So that's its name currently. is oh wow. Cubbyhole, oh wow. Cubbyhole's the farm, oh wow was my response to it. That was just like amazing. And then there's another one that I think is particularly memorable that I call Ashworth Cantaloupe. It's pound sweet. Have you all know the apple pound sweet? It's this big green apple. And when I had it, I bit into it and I was like, melon, cantaloupe. It was just so amazingly flavorful. But I think I often have the reaction that particularly when I'm out in the field and I have just that perfect day, because apples, fruit, period, food, when it's perfectly ripe, it's just like a revelation. And I will say that I'm particularly enjoying right now French Rainettes, the Rainette Franche I grow at my house, delicious. Pomme d'Or, delicious. So there's a short list that I was just like, okay, here are the 20. I'm not gonna do that. And John Bunker once did this, and I was like, that's the answer. Oh, you're asking me to pick among my children, right? So I would also say there's a something about this question as well. The thing that I adore about apples is that everybody in here, I could take 38 apples and give them to you, and every one of you would find one apple in it and be like, oh my God, I love this, right? But it wouldn't be the same. We all taste differently. Our sensory perception is different. The day that I have a cold, I might, blah, 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 blah. But the great thing about the diversity of apples is it's not the lowest common denominator. Everybody gets to be happy. And I say this with tastings a lot. I can start a fight in my class by saying, oh, do you like russets more? Or blah, 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 blah. But the reality is each of you tastes differently. You experience it differently. And that's what I love about this work, is making sure that diversity is still available to people. So it's a little bit of a cop-out, but yeah. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
So, students, before you go, so my students know that I'm obsessed with taking pictures of everybody. I would love if we could get